Welcome to Warfare Codex. If you enjoy fascinating and unusual history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories. Now, let's dive into the strange and extraordinary world of history's most unique individuals, the harsh realities of frontier living. For many settlers, their first sight of their new home was a vast, empty plain stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no roads, no stores, and no neighbors for miles. If they were lucky, they had a small wooden cabin. If not, they built their homes from whatever they could find, sometimes even sod, cutting out thick slabs of grass and earth to create crude shelters known as soddies. These homes were cool in the summer and warm in the winter, but they had major drawbacks. They were dark, damp, infested with bugs and mice, and after heavy rain, they sometimes collapsed entirely. Water was a constant concern. Wells had to be dug by hand, often taking weeks of exhausting labor with no guarantee of success. Those who couldn't find a good water source had to haul barrels from rivers or streams, sometimes traveling miles through hostile territory. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a matter of life and death. Food was another struggle. Settlers relied heavily on hunting, but it was unpredictable. Buffalo were once plentiful, but overhunting by settlers and commercial hunters had driven them to near extinction by the late 1800s. Deer, rabbits, and wild birds were common alternatives, but they weren't always easy to find. Crops were unreliable. Many settlers were unfamiliar with the harsh soil and erratic weather. A single drought, an unexpected frost, or a swarm of locusts could destroy a family's entire food supply. The constant battle against nature. The Wild West was as deadly as it was beautiful. Summer heat could reach unbearable levels, drying up rivers and turning farmland to dust. Winters, on the other hand, were brutal, especially in the northern territories. Blizzards could bury entire settlements under snow, trapping people indoors for weeks. If you ran out of firewood or food, survival became a desperate struggle. Storms were another deadly force. Lightning strikes could ignite massive prairie fires that swept across the land at terrifying speeds, consuming everything in their path. Tornadoes ripped apart entire homesteads, leaving families with nothing. And then there were floods, sudden, violent, and merciless, washing away crops, livestock, and homes. Wild animals added to the danger. Wolves and mountain lions prowled the frontier, attacking livestock and even people. Bears were a constant threat in forested regions, while rattlesnakes lurked in the tall grass, striking at unsuspecting travelers. A single snake bite, far from medical help, often meant a slow and agonizing death. Survival was a family effort. Frontier life was unforgiving, but those who survived did so through sheer grit and hard work. Men spent their days farming, hunting, or working as blacksmiths, trappers, or traders. They built fences, tended livestock, and defended their land from both bandits and wild animals. Many worked from sunrise to sunset, with no guarantee that their efforts would pay off. Women were just as tough. They didn't just keep house. They made everything from scratch. They churned butter, baked bread, preserved food for the winter, and sewed clothes by hand. Many women were skilled with firearms, ready to defend their homes if necessary. Some even worked as doctors, midwives, or teachers in their communities. Others ran boarding houses, saloons, or small shops, becoming the backbone of their towns. Children had no easy life either. They worked alongside their parents from a young age, tending animals, gathering firewood, and helping with farming. Schools were rare, and many children never received a formal education. Instead, they learned survival skills: how to ride, shoot, fish, and navigate the land. Illness and death were constant companions. Medicine in the Wild West was primitive at best. Doctors were few and far between, and most had little formal training. They relied on crude treatments, home remedies, and often dangerous methods like bloodletting. Antibiotics didn't exist yet, so even a small cut could lead to a deadly infection. Diseases spread rapidly in the close quarters of frontier towns and settlements. Dysentery, tuberculosis, smallpox, and typhoid fever were among the most feared killers. Many settlements experienced devastating outbreaks, wiping out entire families within days. Vaccinations were rare, and quarantine was often the only option, if it came in time. Childbirth was one of the greatest risks women faced. With no hospitals and few trained midwives, complications often meant death for both mother and child. Many women made out wills before giving birth, knowing they might not survive. Travel was a gamble. With death, getting from one place to another was an adventure in itself. Roads were little more than dirt trails, often turning to thick mud after a rainstorm. A simple journey of 20 miles could take an entire day by wagon. Horses and stagecoaches were the main modes of transportation, but they came with their own dangers. Stagecoach travel was notoriously risky. Coaches were often targeted by bandits who ambushed them in remote areas. Some passengers carried hidden pistols, ready to fight for their lives if needed. Even if you avoided bandits, accidents were common. A broken wheel or overturned coach could leave travelers stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest settlement. For those heading west in wagon trains, the journey was grueling. Travelers faced exhaustion, starvation, disease, and attacks from both hostile raiders and wild animals. Many never made it to their destination, their graves scattered along the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails. Why did people keep coming? Despite the hardships, people continued pushing westward. Some were driven by the promise of free land, thanks to the Homestead Act, which offered 160 acres to settlers willing to farm it for 5 years. Others chased the dream of gold, risking everything in hopes of striking it rich in the mines of California, Colorado, and the Black Hills. Some were escaping their pasts, criminals, drifters, and outcasts looking for a fresh start. Others were simply seeking freedom, far from the crowded cities of the East. Whatever their reasons, they came in waves, carving out a new life in the most dangerous and untamed land America had ever known. For those who survived, the West was more than just a place. It was a test of endurance, a battle against the elements, and a fight to carve out a future in an unforgiving world. And for every story of success, there were countless others buried beneath the dust of the frontier, forgotten by history but not by the land that claimed them. The law meant little in the early days. Justice in the Wild West was swift, unpredictable, and often deadly. In many settlements, there were no official lawmen, no courts, and no jails. Instead, frontier justice ruled, meaning if someone stole your horse, you didn't wait for a trial. You and your neighbors hunted the thief down, and more often than not, justice was served with a bullet or a noose. Even in established towns, law enforcement was often weak. A single sheriff was usually responsible for keeping the peace, but with limited manpower and an abundance of criminals, the job was nearly impossible. Many lawmen were corrupt or former outlaws themselves, willing to look the other way for a price. Vigilante groups were common. If a town's residents believed the law was ineffective, they took matters into their own hands. Lynch mobs formed quickly, hanging suspected criminals from trees or lampposts without trials. Some of these vigilante groups became notorious, acting as private armies that settled personal grudges under the guise of justice. Outlaws and bounty hunters roamed freely. The Wild West was home to some of history's most infamous criminals. Jesse James and his gang terrorized banks and trains. Billy the Kid became a legend for his gunfights, and Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch pulled off daring heists. These men weren't romanticized heroes, they were ruthless killers who left behind trails of blood and destruction. But for every outlaw, there was someone hunting them. Bounty hunters were men who tracked down fugitives for a cash reward. Some were former criminals themselves, switching sides when the price was right. Others were ex-soldiers or drifters willing to risk their lives for money. Bringing in a wanted man, dead or alive, was a literal statement, and often it was easier to collect the bounty on a corpse than to drag a dangerous fugitive to trial. Saloons were the heart of every town. No matter how rough or remote a town was, it almost always had at least one saloon. These weren't just bars, they were social centers, gambling halls, and business hubs. Deals were made over whiskey, fortunes were won and lost in poker games, and grudges often ended with gunfire. Bartenders were some of the most important people in town. They acted as unofficial bankers, keeping track of debts, and sometimes even serving as mediators in disputes. Saloons were also where travelers got their news, long before newspapers were common. A newcomer could walk into a saloon and hear all the latest gossip: who had been killed, who had struck gold, and which outlaw was hiding nearby. Women in the West were more than just settlers. Women in the Wild West were far more than wives and mothers. They were survivors, entrepreneurs, and sometimes even outlaws themselves. Some women, like Calamity Jane, became famous for their gunslinging skills and toughness. Others, like Belle Starr, built criminal empires. Many women ran boarding houses, saloons, or stores, playing vital roles in the growth of their towns. In places where men outnumbered women 5-1, a smart businesswoman could make a fortune providing food, lodging, and entertainment. Some women became landowners, staking claims to property and defending it just as fiercely as any man. Brothels were a major part of town life. While many women were forced into the profession, some used it to gain wealth and power. High-class brothels, known as parlor houses, catered to wealthy clients and were run like businesses, with madams controlling large sums of money. Gambling and crime went hand in hand. Gambling was one of the biggest pastimes of the West. Poker, blackjack, and faro were played in every saloon, sometimes for small stakes, sometimes for fortunes. Cheat at the wrong table, and you could end up dead before your next hand. Card sharps, professional gamblers who made a living by cheating, were a common sight. Some had hidden sleeves for extra cards, while others used marked decks. If caught, they faced instant justice, often delivered with a fist, a knife, or a bullet. Bank and train robberies were so common that banks in the West often had reinforced walls and steel bars. Stagecoach companies hired armed guards to ride shotgun, literally sitting next to the driver with a loaded rifle ready to shoot any bandits who tried to rob them. Entertainment was simple, but wildlife in the West was harsh. But people still found ways to entertain themselves. Traveling circuses, medicine shows, and rodeos provided much-needed relief from the monotony of survival. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show became one of the most famous traveling acts of the time, featuring trick shooting, reenactments of famous gunfights, and performances from real-life cowboys and Native American warriors. Rodeos showcased bronco riding, bull wrestling, and lasso tricks, attracting huge crowds wherever they were held. Music was another key part of frontier life. Cowboys sang ballads on the range, miners sang work songs in the camps, and every saloon had a piano player pounding out lively tunes. Church gatherings and barn dances were among the few places where men and women could socialize freely, and they were often the highlight of the month for isolated communities. The railroads changed everything. The arrival of the railroad transformed the West. Towns that once took weeks to reach by wagon could now be accessed in days. Supplies, news, and lawmen traveled faster than ever before. But the railroads also brought trouble. Many settlements turned into ghost towns overnight when the train routes bypassed them, leaving once thriving communities abandoned. Train robberies became a favorite crime of outlaws, and some gangs, like the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, specialized in hitting trains at full speed. The rail companies fought back by hiring armed guards and, in some cases, even installing safes that exploded if tampered with. A land of opportunity and death. The Wild West was a place of extremes: opportunity and tragedy, fortune and ruin, civilization and chaos. For some, it was a land of endless possibilities where a determined person could build a new life from nothing. For others, it was a graveyard, swallowing those who couldn't keep up with its relentless pace. Towns rose and fell overnight. Gold rushes created instant millionaires and left just as many penniless. Gunslingers and lawmen made their names in the dust of the frontier, only to be forgotten when the next generation arrived. The West was not just a place, it was a test of human endurance. It was where the strong thrived, the weak perished, and the legends that shaped American history were born. Thanks for watching Warfare Codex. If you enjoyed this journey into history's strangest figures, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more amazing stories. See you in the next one.